I mean, some may sound strange, but I am inside. I find large groups of people difficult to deal with. If I go in where there are 100 people in a room, I feel very uncomfortable.
30 years of laughter, thousands of nights, millions of memories. Yet, as Johnny Carson waited for his last Tonight Show, the man who made the world smile stood quietly in the shadows. A close friend asked what he was thinking. Johnny leaned in, his voice soft but certain. "After tonight, everything changes," he whispered, leaving a pause heavy enough to stop hearts. The words carried a truth that only he understood. When those backstage finally heard what followed, their eyes filled with tears. Johnny's final whisper remains one of television's most haunting moments, and it will leave you speechless. The last night of Johnny Carson. The evening of May 22, 1992, settled over Burbank with a soft California glow. The sky above NBC studios burned a faint orange before giving way to deepening blue, and the streets around the studio hummed with energy. Limousines slid to a stop at the gates, spilling out famous faces who had come to witness history. Fans lined the sidewalks, their cameras flashing like 1,000 tiny stars. Inside, security guards moved with quiet urgency, checking credentials and guiding guests toward the soundstage that had, for 3 decades, belonged to one man. It was the night of Johnny Carson's final Tonight Show, and everyone who stepped through those doors felt it in their bones. The air inside the building carried a strange electricity, a mix of celebration and heartbreak. Producers hurried across the polished floors with clipboards clutched to their chests. Stagehands whispered to one another while adjusting lights and cables. Some tried to smile, but their eyes betrayed the truth. This was not just another show. In the control room, monitors flickered with test images, the glowing screens casting pale light on faces tense with focus. "Camera 3 needs a tighter," a technician murmured. "Let's keep it perfect tonight." Every small detail mattered. Nothing could go wrong when a king of late night was about to say goodbye. Beyond the heavy studio doors, the audience waited, a restless sea of laughter and nervous chatter. Couples held hands, strangers exchanged knowing glances, and every eye stayed fixed on the famous stage curtain. They had come not only to be entertained, but to honor a man who had shaped their evenings for 30 unforgettable years. Around the world, millions of viewers settled in front of their televisions, hearts beating with the same anticipation. Politicians, movie stars, and ordinary families alike felt the pull of a single moment that marked the end of an era. Johnny Carson had been more than a talk show host. He had been a nightly companion, a gentle voice that carried people through long days and quiet nights. His sharp wit, his perfectly timed pauses, and his easy laughter had defined American late-night television. For 3 decades, he ruled the hours after dark, turning new comedians into household names and giving audiences a reason to stay awake just a little longer. He wasn't just on TV. One stagehand whispered, adjusting a microphone. He was part of our lives. Backstage, the atmosphere shifted from bright celebration to something quieter, almost sacred. The hallways smelled faintly of fresh paint and old wood, the familiar scent of a studio that had seen countless shows, but never a night like this. Crew members who had worked with Johnny for years stood in small groups, their usual chatter replaced by soft conversation. Some clutched coffee cups they had long forgotten to drink. Others simply stared at the dressing room door, waiting for it to open. Inside that room sat Johnny Carson, the man who had made America laugh for 3 decades. He wore a crisp suit, his silver hair perfectly combed, but there was a stillness in him that no one could mistake. Away from the roar of the crowd, his famous smile faded into something more thoughtful. He rested his hands on the arm of his chair and gazed at the mirror in front of him. The reflection staring back was familiar, yet somehow distant. A man at the end of a long journey. A quiet knock broke the silence. "5 minutes, Johnny," a stage manager called softly. Johnny turned his head slightly and offered a gentle reply. "Thank you," he said, his voice calm but carrying a weight that lingered in the air. As he stood, the dressing room lights cast a warm halo around him. He straightened his jacket and took a slow breath. 30 years of shows, jokes, and interviews had led to this night. He knew every camera angle, every cue, every laugh line, yet something about tonight felt different. It was not the performance that stirred him, but the finality. This was the last walk to the stage he had called home. He stepped into the hallway where longtime producer Fred de Cordova waited. Fred tried for a cheerful grin, but his eyes shone with unshed tears. "Ready, Johnny?" he asked softly. Johnny gave a small nod. "As ready as I'll ever be," he answered, a trace of a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. The crew parted as he moved toward the curtain. Conversations dropped to whispers. Camera operators adjusted their headsets, their eyes following every step. He had walked this hallway thousands of times, but tonight, each footfall echoed louder, carrying the weight of memories only he could feel. Just before the entrance to the stage, Johnny paused. The music of the opening theme had not yet begun, and the air around him seemed to hold its breath. He turned slightly, catching the eye of a trusted confidant, a close friend who had stood beside him through years of triumph and quiet moments of doubt. Leaning in, Johnny placed a hand on the friend's shoulder. The bustling studio seemed to fade as he whispered a few soft words. The friend listened, eyes widening just enough to betray surprise. Whatever Johnny said was meant only for that small circle of trust. The moment lasted only seconds. Then Johnny straightened, his familiar composure returning. From the other side of the curtain came the distant sound of the audience growing restless, their applause already beginning to rise. The stage manager raised a hand, signaling it was time. Johnny gave one last quiet nod to the crew and stepped toward the light. As he disappeared through the curtain, the hallway behind him fell silent. Those who had witnessed the whisper exchanged brief, puzzled glances, but no one spoke. The words remained between Johnny and the few who had heard them, a secret carried into the night. On stage, the audience erupted in cheers, but backstage, the air stayed heavy with the mystery of what had just passed. The greatest talk show host in television history had taken his final walk with a secret only he could fully understand. Johnny Carson's quiet hour. Johnny was a man of habits, each one carefully kept like a magician guarding a trick. He liked his space neat, his jacket pressed to perfection, and his mind calm before the storm of applause. A small deck of playing cards rested on the table beside him, a nod to his lifelong love of magic. He often shuffled them when the room grew too still, the soft slide of paper against paper easing the weight of silence. Tonight, the cards remained untouched. His hands rested on his knees, fingers still as stone. He breathed in, slow and steady, as if measuring the passing minutes. Outside the door, the building pulsed with life. Producers rushing down hallways, camera operators calling out adjustments, ushers guiding restless guests to their seats. But inside, time moved differently. Johnny preferred it that way. Off camera, he was reserved, even shy, a man who valued the privacy that fame could never quite steal. A gentle knock broke the quiet. "Johnny?" "Wardrobe check," a voice called. He turned slightly, the smallest smile crossing his face. "Come in," he said, his voice smooth but soft. An assistant entered, carrying the crisp suit jacket that would soon shine under the stage lights. The fabric smelled faintly of starch and fresh linen. Johnny stood, allowing the jacket to be slipped over his shoulders. "Looks perfect," the assistant murmured. "Let's hope the jokes do too," Johnny replied, a glint of humor warming his eyes for a fleeting second. When the assistant left, the door clicked shut, sealing him back into solitude. Johnny looked once more into the mirror. He adjusted his tie, smoothed the lapels, and studied the man looking back. This was not the smiling host millions saw every night. This was the private Johnny, reflective, careful, carrying 30 years of memories in the lines of his face. He thought of the young man who had first walked onto that stage decades ago, full of ambition and nerves. Now that same stage waited for his final bow. Minutes slipped by. Another knock. This time it was Fred de Cordova, his longtime producer and trusted friend. Fred stepped inside with a gentle grin. "How's the king of late night holding up?" he asked. Johnny gave a small shrug, trying not to think about what comes after. He said quietly. Fred studied him for a moment, his eyes soft with understanding. "The country's watching, Johnny, but take your time. We're with you." Johnny's lips curved into a faint smile. "You always are." As Fred left, Doc Severinsen, the bandleader who had played him on and off stage for years, peeked in. "We're ready whenever you are," Doc said, his usual cheer softened by the weight of the night. "Tell the band to give me one last perfect entrance," Johnny replied, his voice carrying a warmth that masked the ache beneath. When the door closed again, the room felt even quieter. Johnny rested his hands on the back of the chair and took a long breath. The final minutes before showtime had always been a mix of excitement and nerves, but tonight they carried something deeper. Each tick of the clock was a reminder that an era was ending. 30 years of laughter, interviews, and shared moments with millions of strangers Soon it would all belong to the past. He thought of the people on the other side of the curtain, the audience waiting for the music to begin, the crew members who had become family, the millions watching from their living rooms. For 3 decades, they had welcomed him into their nights, trusting him to bring comfort and laughter. How do you say goodbye to that? How do you thank an entire country for letting you be part of their lives? A soft rap on the door pulled him from his thoughts. 2 minutes, a stagehand called. Johnny stood still, eyes fixed on the mirror. He wanted to walk out there with the calm of a professional, but his heart carried a weight words could not hold. He had written jokes for this night, planned his remarks, but nothing on the cue cards captured what he truly felt. The farewell he owed was larger than anything he could speak. Another breath, another memory. He thought of his very first show, the nervous laughter, the thrill of hearing the audience respond. He thought of the countless nights when a perfect punchline lit up the room, of the quiet drives home when the applause still echoed in his ears, every laugh, every story, every late-night connection. Tonight he was closing the door on all of it. Fred returned for the final call. "It's time," he said softly. Johnny nodded, his movements measured, almost slow. He stepped into the hallway where the familiar buzz of activity wrapped around him. Crew members turned to watch, their faces filled with quiet respect. Some smiled, others held back tears. He gave small nods as he passed, acknowledging each person without breaking the fragile calm of the moment. As they reached the curtain, the music of the opening theme began to build. The audience roared on the other side, their excitement spilling through the thick fabric. Johnny paused, the sound washing over him like a tide. He turned to Fred, his eyes thoughtful. "Thank you for everything," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Fred squeezed his shoulder. "It's been an honor," he replied. Johnny looked toward the curtain but did not move. Instead, he leaned closer to Fred, lowering his voice even more. The words that followed were quiet enough to vanish beneath the music, a soft confession meant only for a trusted ear. Fred's eyes flickered with surprise, then softened with understanding. The night the curtain closed, Johnny Carson stepped into the light, calm and polished in his crisp suit, the perfect host as always. Yet behind his steady smile, something quieter flickered, an unspoken knowledge that this would be the last time he would greet America from that stage. The cameras captured a man who seemed unchanged. Johnny waved to the crowd, his eyes warm, his movements smooth, every gesture a master class in ease. He delivered his opening lines with the same quick charm that had carried him through 30 years of late nights. Jokes landed cleanly, laughter rippled through the studio, and for a brief moment it felt like any other show. But in the small pauses between punchlines, there was a different kind of silence, a softness that hinted at the truth. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice rich and steady. "This is, well, a special night." The words were simple, but they settled over the room like a gentle weight. Behind the laughter, the studio carried a current of emotion that no joke could erase. Camera operators leaned a little closer to their viewfinders. Stagehands lingered at the edges of the set, their faces both proud and wistful. In the control room, producers watched the monitors with damp eyes, pretending to focus on the technical cues. Everyone knew they were witnessing the end of something rare, something that might never come again. The show unfolded with a rhythm that only Johnny could command. He shared small memories, offered sly smiles, and teased the band with his familiar dry wit. Each story sent waves of laughter through the audience, but each laugh seemed touched by something more: gratitude, nostalgia, even a quiet kind of grief. It was as if every person in the room wanted to hold on to the sound, to keep it alive for just a little longer. When a surprise montage of past highlights played on the large studio screen, the room softened into quiet awe. Old clips flashed by, famous guests, playful sketches, moments of pure, unscripted magic. The audience cheered at each memory, but many wiped their eyes at the same time. Johnny stood off to the side, watching his history play back to him in flickers of light. His smile never broke, but his hands folded tighter behind his back. During the first commercial break, a stagehand slipped onto the set to adjust a microphone. As the cameras went dark, a quiet hum filled the studio. From the wings, producer Fred de Cordova stepped forward with a clipboard, but instead of giving instructions, he simply placed a hand on Johnny's arm. No words passed between them, only a look that carried decades of shared nights and private conversations. Johnny gave a small nod, his eyes calm but unreadable. Others around them carried their silent messages. A crew member near the soundboard clutched a folded piece of paper so tightly the edges bent under his fingers. A makeup artist dabbed at the corner of her eye, pretending to check the powder on a guest's cheek. In the band, Doc Severinsen raised his trumpet and held it for a heartbeat before lowering it again, as if bracing himself for the next cue. They all knew something more had passed backstage before the show began. A whisper, a sentence meant only for a few. None of them spoke of it, but the knowledge hung in the air like a soft echo. When the cameras returned, Johnny launched back into the show with effortless grace. He thanked his guests with warm handshakes, trading jokes that drew honest laughter. At moments he leaned against the desk, pausing just long enough for the audience to sense the weight beneath his calm exterior. "It's been a wonderful ride," he said at one point, the words simple but edged with finality. Applause thundered in response, rising and falling like a tide that refused to ebb. As the final segment approached, a hush settled over the studio despite the bright lights and cheerful music. Johnny glanced toward the band, then back to the crowd. His eyes moved slowly across the faces before him, as if he wanted to memorize every detail: the glow of the cameras, the sheen of the stage floor, the way strangers shared the same breath of anticipation. He cleared his throat, and the room leaned forward. "I cannot begin to tell you," he said softly, "how much these years have meant to me." The audience erupted in applause before he could continue, a sound so loud it seemed to shake the rafters. People rose to their feet, clapping and cheering until the studio felt alive with gratitude. The ovations stretched on and on, far longer than anyone expected. Johnny stood still, his eyes shining but steady, allowing the moment to wash over him. Backstage, crew members exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of pride and quiet sorrow. A camera operator lowered his headset for a second, wiping a sleeve across his eyes. The folded note that had sat in a sound technician's hand now rested on the edge of the console, untouched. Whatever had been whispered earlier remained hidden, a small secret beneath the roar of public farewell. Finally, the applause began to fade, replaced by a soft murmur of sniffles and sighs. Johnny smiled gently as if to comfort the room. He thanked his audience once more, his voice carrying a warmth that reached through the television screens and into living rooms across the country. There was no grand speech, no dramatic confession, only a quiet grace that seemed to say everything words could not. The closing music began to swell, and the show moved toward its final moments. Johnny shook hands with his guests, hugged Doc Severinsen, and turned to wave at the crowd. The cameras followed him as he stepped from behind the desk, the applause rising again like a second wave. He paused at center stage, lifted a hand, and gave a small, elegant bow. The credits rolled across the screen, but inside the studio no one wanted to move. The audience remained on their feet, clapping until their palms stung. Johnny stood for a breath longer, eyes scanning the crowd before turning toward the familiar curtain. As he stepped into the wings, the lights dimmed slightly, casting soft shadows across the narrow hallway. He stopped for a single private second, just out of view of the cameras. Behind him, the applause thundered on. Ahead of him, the quiet of the backstage corridor waited like an open door. Fred de Cordova stood a few feet away, his hands clasped in front of him. Johnny met his eyes and gave a small nod. "That's it," he whispered, his voice barely rising above the fading music. Fred swallowed hard and managed a quiet reply. "You did it, Johnny." Johnny glanced back toward the stage one last time. The curtain now hid the cheering crowd, but the sound still rolled through the building. He let it settle around him, a final wave of love and gratitude. Then he turned and walked deeper into the shadows, each step measured, each breath steady. The applause slowly passed away, replaced by a silence so deep it seemed to press against the walls. In that stillness, the reality of the moment settled over everyone who remained. The stage stood empty, the desk and chairs bathed in soft light. The man who had filled those nights with laughter was gone, leaving only echoes of his presence and a whisper that would stay hidden with those who had heard it. Outside the studio, the world continued. Cars hummed along the freeway. Late-night diners flickered with neon light, but inside, the quiet felt sacred. Crew members lingered in the wings, reluctant to break the spell. A few exchanged hushed words, but most simply stood in silence, letting the weight of farewell rest where it belonged. Johnny Carson, the man who had been a nightly companion to millions, had walked away with the same quiet dignity that defined his career. He gave his audience everything but the mystery of his final whisper, leaving behind a night that would live forever in memory. A night when laughter and silence met, and the curtain closed on a legend. The whisper that stayed behind. The cameras went dark with a soft click, and the bright glow of the studio lights began to fade. A hush settled over NBC's Studio One, a silence so deep it felt almost physical. For 30 years the stage had belonged to Johnny Carson, but now the applause had stopped, the music had gone silent, and the man who once filled the room with laughter had stepped away. The audience had left reluctantly, their excitement drifting out into the cool California night, but behind the heavy studio doors, a different story began to unfold. Backstage, crew members moved with a strange, careful energy. The show was over, yet no one wanted to rush. Cables were coiled, cameras rolled back into their corners, and microphone stands lowered with a soft metallic sigh. Every action felt deliberate, as though each piece of equipment carried a memory too precious to disturb. A stagehand set a stack of cue cards onto a table and let out a slow breath. "It's done," he whispered, more to himself than anyone else. But even in the quiet, another sound lingered, a low murmur of curiosity that passed from one worker to another. "Did you hear what he said?" one technician asked under his breath. "Right before he walked off?" Another nodded but offered no answer, only a knowing glance. The question rippled through the hallways like a secret breeze. What did Johnny whisper? Those who had been closest to the final moments carried themselves differently. Fred de Cordova, the longtime producer who had stood beside Johnny for decades, walked with his head slightly bowed, his hands tucked behind his back. Doc Severinsen lingered near the bandstand, polishing his trumpet with unnecessary care. Their faces gave nothing away, but their eyes held something private, something that belonged only to those who had been close enough to hear. A young stagehand, new to the crew, dared to ask Fred directly. "Mr. de Cordova," he said softly, "did he tell you something before he left?" Fred paused, his eyes meeting the young man's. For a heartbeat, it seemed he might answer. Instead, he offered a gentle smile and placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. "Some words aren't meant for everyone," he said quietly. Then he walked on, leaving the question floating in the air. In a corner of the hallway, Johnny's closest friend from the crew leaned against the wall, eyes fixed on the floor. She had been standing near the curtain when Johnny stopped, turned, and leaned toward Fred with a faint smile. The sound of his voice had been soft, almost lost beneath the fading applause, but she had caught the words. They were not a joke or a secret plan. They were something far more delicate. He said, "Tell them I felt every laugh," she whispered at last to a fellow crew member. Her voice trembled slightly as she spoke. "That's all. Tell them I felt every laugh." The words moved through the small group like a quiet wave. They were simple, almost ordinary, yet they carried the weight of 30 years. Johnny had built his career on making people laugh, night after night, year after year, and in those few soft syllables, he had given his final gift, a promise that every cheer, every chuckle, every roar of joy had reached him. He had heard it all. He had carried it with him. Doc Severinsen, polishing his trumpet nearby, closed his eyes when he heard the whisper repeated. "That sounds like Johnny," he said, his voice warm with memory. "That's exactly him. No big speech, just a heart." As the crew absorbed the message, the atmosphere shifted. The question that had hovered like a restless bird now settled into quiet understanding. Johnny's farewell had not been for the cameras or the history books. It had been for the people who shared those nights with him, a small truth delivered to a few who would carry it forward. Outside the studio, the parking lot had emptied, leaving only a handful of cars scattered under the dim streetlights. Inside, the once busy hallways now echoed with the soft scrape of equipment cases and the faint creak of stage doors closing. A janitor swept a forgotten corner, the sound of the broom gentle and rhythmic, like the fading heartbeat of the night. Fred returned to the stage one last time, standing alone beneath the muted glow of the overhead lights. The set looked strangely vulnerable without the cameras and laughter, the desk and chairs sitting in quiet stillness. He walked to the center and paused, his gaze sweeping the empty audience seats. In the quiet, he could almost hear Johnny's voice again, the quick wit, the warm laughter, the soft farewell. "Tell them I felt every laugh." The words lingered in Fred's mind, a melody only a few would ever hear. Years would pass, and the world would change. But those who were there that night never forgot. Some kept the whisper to themselves, holding it close like a treasured keepsake. Others shared it gently, passing it along to new generations who had never stayed up late to watch Johnny's magic in real time. Each time the words were spoken, they carried the same quiet power, reminding listeners that the connection between performer and audience is more than applause. It is a bond of shared joy. Even decades later, when the studio had been rebuilt and new shows had come and gone, the memory of that night remained. Visitors who stepped into the space sometimes claimed they felt something in the air, a faint echo of laughter that refused to fade. Crew members who had been there would smile knowingly but say nothing. The whisper belonged to the past, yet it continued to live in every retelling. On quiet evenings when reruns of The Tonight Show played on late-night channels, families would gather and laugh at Johnny's perfect timing, his playful eyes, his gentle grace. Most never knew about the words he left behind, but those who did could hear them in every pause, every carefully timed punchline, every burst of laughter that seemed to reach across the years. Back in Studio One, the night of his farewell ended with a final, haunting image. The stage stood empty, the desk bathed in a soft glow that seemed to hold its memory. The chairs faced an audience that was no longer there. In the stillness, it was easy to imagine Johnny standing once more in the center, hands in his pockets, a small smile playing at the corner of his mouth. The whisper he left behind was not loud, not grand, not meant to be shouted from headlines. It was a quiet truth, a private melody of gratitude. Tell them I felt every laugh. It carried the heart of a man who spent 3 decades making others happy, a man who understood that the greatest gift is not the applause but the shared feeling behind it.